Brilliant. Hello, everybody, and welcome to tonight's whisky tasting. My name is Billy Abbott. I am the Whisky Exchange's head of training and content. But as that's not a particularly interesting job title, people call me the Whisky Exchange's ambassador. I get out there, talk about the wonderful things we do a bit of teaching about whiskey on the way, as well as all other kinds of drink. So tonight we've got a tasting looking at the wonders of whiskey from around the world. May is our World Whiskey Month, and one of the great things about May is that in the middle of it we have World Whiskey Day, which, while it's just a celebration of whiskey all around the world, we like to actually look at whiskies from around the world that we don't normally think about. So this tasting pack we've got today, it's one of our tasting packs we've been doing for ages on our website because we like showcasing these whiskies, and there's a great way of exploring the whiskies you wouldn't necessarily find out in the wild if you weren't looking for them. So we've got whiskey from everywhere, from the exotic locations of Taiwan through to Norfolk, which is particularly foreign. So if you have any questions, please ask away on Facebook, or if you're in our Zoom room, please ask away on Zoom. But first things first, we want to grab, oh no, wrong end, start with this end. We're going to start with an English whiskey. So while whiskey is normally thought of as a Scottish, American, and Irish thing, that's really where they started from. Over the past 100-some years, it's been spreading out all over the world. From Japan, which people have only really been hearing about quite recently, but has been going for coming on 100 years now since the first distillery opened there. Pretty much anywhere you can find grain, somebody's made some kind of beer out of it, and if someone's made some beer, there's a very good chance someone's distilled it and made something that is a little bit at least like whiskey. And so while a lot of the distillers started off by taking the ideas from Scotland and Ireland, who will always fight over who was first, America very much evolved from them and now does something very, very different. But then that knowledge was sort of spread around the world by people sort of traveling around, taking that knowledge with them. And so there is really now whiskey everywhere. And while it may have started from those starting points of Scotland, Ireland, and the US, it's very much changed now, and there's a lot of stuff going on which is very different, and lots of unique styles which you don't find outside of certain locations. We've got a few bits and pieces here which are a little bit different, but generally these are along the more traditional styles. Over the next few weeks, we're going to bring in some distillers who do things a little bit differently, and you'll be able to try some fantastic and different things. But first things first, we're going to start off with whiskey number 1 from the English Whisky Company, which is a whiskey that we actually chose. So I'll pour some of this. So the English Whisky Company have an interesting sort of founding myth, which is that the patriarch of the family, farmers, they've been farming grain for years, lots of it going to make whiskey. He wanted to retire. He spoke to his son who's going to take over and said, well, what am I going to do in my retirement? And he said, well, I'd like to make whiskey. That'd be nice. So they looked into making a little distillery down the end of the garden, which, being a farm, is quite a big garden. And it's in a field around the corner, and discovered there are lots of legal limits on how small you can make a distillery. So they decided to actually make the smallest distillery they could, which is a quite large distillery. And rather than just being a hobby, it had to be sort of really turned into a company. And while they're still farmers, they're now very much more focused on the whiskey making. And Andrew, who was the son who sorted all this stuff out, is now very much a distillery manager who may do a little bit of farming on the side. But the family and the company are very much focused on making great whiskey in England. They were the first big modern English whiskey distillery, but since then there's been an explosion. Laws have changed, and there's a lot more now going on in the whiskey world in England. Everything from all down the southwest, down in Cornwall, I think, Devon and Cornwall, then there's some distillers down there. There's folks up north, and there's even one which, if I sort of stretch and look out the window over there, I can practically see the top of Bimba as well in northwest London. So they're all over the place now. But English Whisky Company were very much the guys who started it. And David Fitt, their distiller, is probably one of the best distillers in the UK at the moment. He does lots of experiments, does lots of experimental stuff, and is really sort of pushing the boundaries of what you can do within whiskey, thanks to the fact the laws in England are slightly less strict than they are in Scotland and Ireland, which gives you a little bit more flexibility to do weird and wonderful things. So anyway, this first whiskey we have, this is the English Whisky Classic. It's a single cask that we chose a couple of years back. Sukhinder, our big boss, went to visit the distillery because he'd just never been before. You know, it's one of our closest distilleries at the time. And he sort of went, well, I've not visited, that's a bit bad. So he popped in there, and while English Whiskey Company produced lots of really weird and wonderful wine casks and finishes and strange things they do with their whiskey, when you go and visit, the thing they're always really keen on you trying is just their bourbon casks. They're simple ex-bourbon cask whiskey, often thought of, you know, one of the simplest, most boring types of whiskey. It's also my favorite type, and from the English Whiskey Company, it is my favorite style of whiskey that they do. So this is ex-bourbon. I can't remember how old it is. It's not got an age statement on it. It's not particularly old, but it's very much showing off what their style of whiskey is, with the bourbon cask allowing it to age a little bit, but letting the spirit sing, letting the spirit shine through. And this is one of our things we always talk about, the Whiskey Exchange, when we're doing our own whiskies, doing our exclusive whiskies. We want to be able to taste the distillery. We don't want to add in loads, because sometimes you want to add in nice little casky things, but most of the time we want to just show what the distillery is doing, show that spirit, show the character, show the flavors they're creating rather than the casks are creating. So, has everybody poured this one? I see people vaguely looking at me, which is always nice. Hello, people who are vaguely looking at me. Hello, John. Right, so yeah, so I want to go for a nose and a taste of this and see what we reckon. So on the nose, it's very much the style I expect from English whiskey. I visited a year or so ago and walked around their warehouses, which aren't particularly big. The whole place isn't very big. You know, it's the smallest distillery they can make within the law, which is quite big compared to a shed, but it's still quite small compared to a big Scottish distillery. And you walk around these things and they're just, you know, rows and rows of bourbon casks. And I tried a few whiskies there straight from the cask and was absolutely blown away. And this is very much that style of whiskey. This is why I was really impressed by it. It's got quite a lot of fruitiness to it, sort of apples and pears. It's just a thing which I'm slightly obsessed with in whiskey. If you ever see me do a tasting before or read my tasting notes, there's lots of talk of fruit whenever I can find it. It's one of my favorite things in whiskey. But it's got a little bit of spice in there as well. But for me, it's all apple skins and green apples and nice bit of vanilla and spice. Maybe a hint of like Vicks Vapor Rubs or sort of mentholy thing in there as well, but only a little bit. On the palate. Oh, sorry, my first whiskey of the day. I'm a professional. Loads of apples and vanilla. That sort of, for me, it's always sort of like an apple sponge cake, apple upside down cake or something like that. Bit of custard, gentle spice. Into the finish goes into sort of green apple skins. But this is a classic, what I think of as what the English Whiskey Company make when they're making their best whiskey. They've got lots of experiments, as I said. If you want to try the weird 4-grain stuff and multi-grain stuff David's doing, he's used to be a brewer. So he used to do these weird and wonderful beers using lots of different grains and hops and things like that. He's taken that knowledge and he's brought it into the whiskey world, as well as seeing what other people do with whiskey outside of Scotland and Ireland and the UK, and tweak the ideas around. So you look at their range, they've got things which look a little bit like Irish pot still, things which look a little bit like some of the weird and wonderful things they do with extra grains in Scotland, things which look like those mash bills you might find over in America. But pushing those boundaries, trying to create new styles of whiskey that you don't find anywhere else, but also at its heart, still doing stuff like this. So, Gareth, do you have a question? Hi, Gareth. So
yes, we have a question from Hits Chuan on Facebook, and it is, how do they infuse certain flavors into whiskies?
Okay, actually, yeah, this is one which Glenfiddich's brand ambassador, Mark Thompson, I spoke to him years ago when I started doing tastings, and he gave me sort of lots of ideas. But he said one of the things people often get when you talk about flavors in whiskey, he talked about this incredible whiskey with bananas in, and someone asked him, when do they put the bananas in the whiskey? And the answer is you don't. So how do they get these flavors into the whiskey? This is all down to production. All these different flavors that I've been talking about, if you dig into how whiskey's made, you can find the source of all these different flavors. So I was talking about spice and vanilla. Vanilla and spice is a classic character of bourbon casks. Bourbon casks are made of American oak. American oak's got lots of vanillin in it, and it's also had bourbon in it before. So the bourbon strips out some of the hot, spicier notes. but leaves some of that vanilla character in the wood, as well as the wood having some spicy notes as well. So that's pulled into the whiskey. The fruit I was talking about, those are generally caused by chemical compounds called esters. And the thing about esters is that they are the foundation of fruity flavors in everything. So esters are great if you want really, really fruity things. You get really ridiculously fruity, funky, weird, banana-y rums and things which smell like sweets. That's all esters. So apples and things like that, apples and pears and tropical fruit and things like that, they're all going to come from esters. And esters are created during fermentation and during distillation and during aging. So the way that you ferment, the way you distill, the way you age, everything you do in your production process will create more or less of these flavors depending on the way you work with them. So yeah, how do they get all these flavors in there? They add them by doing little bits of production which will create those flavors. They don't add them in wholesale and physically. There's no flavoring compounds added to any of these whiskeys, and for most real whiskey there's not any flavoring compound added in. There's no actual fruit or anything like that, you know, shoved in. The only things are the raw ingredients, the wood of the cask, the previous contents of the cask, and time. And this is the thing that creates all these different flavors. I think I should probably answer that. Sorry, I could talk about flavor creation in whiskey for maybe significantly too long. So anyway, yes, this is very much, I say, the classic sort of style I think of when I drink English whiskey. They also do peated whiskies as well. They do, as I say, all these different other grain things. They just pretty much looked into all the different styles of whiskey that are out there and try to do a little bit of everything, try and do their own take on it. And because the distillery is quite small, the size of each run of production, if they're smaller stills, they're small mash tun, they're small fermenters, is such that they can do these changes really quickly. They can do lots of iterations. They can do lots of really cool experiments, as well as doing their everyday whiskies. And so they have lots of experimental stuff, lots of cool things coming out. And it's really worth keeping an eye on them because there's going to be more coming down the line. You know, when I was visiting, we sort of looked over at a mash and sort of, David, is this what we think it is? And it's like, no. Yes, it is. And I can't say what it is. But yes, give it a couple of years and you'll have some stuff which is really interesting, which I want to try. So anyway, so if you want to move on to whiskey number 2. Hopefully I've got all of these same order as you have. Just make sure I have. Yes, I have. So this is a whiskey from Miyagikyo by Nikka, which is Japan's second biggest whiskey company and the second one to be founded. Miyagikyo is one of their 2 distilleries. It's their newest distillery. It's on the main island of Japan, Honshu. Oh, I need to pour some. Nikka, I say they're the second biggest Japanese whiskey company and the second oldest. The biggest one is Suntory. And Suntory were founded back in the 1920s, I think. So we're a couple of years away now from the 100th anniversary of Japanese whiskey being a thing. And the first distiller for Suntory was a guy called Masataka Taketsuru. And Taketsuru, he learned how to distill in Scotland, had a few trips over there, met his wife in Scotland, Rita, who he brought back to Japan with her. There's now a Japanese TV series all about, called Masa, I think, which is all about the life of Rita and Masataka in Japanese society with her adjusting to Japan from Scotland. I've been told it's great, never seen it. But it's all about, you know, these early days of this distillery. He, along with Shinjiro Tori, the guy who started Suntory, they created this thing. And after 10 years, his contract finished and he left to found his own company, Nikka. They have very different ideas on how to make whiskey and anything like that. So he wanted to make whiskey in a place that reminded him of Scotland. So he went north and he found nice, cool, mountainous region, built a distillery called Yuichi. The company grew and they wanted another distillery, so they built a distillery called Miyagikyo, and this is Miyagikyo. Well, Yuichi specializes in smoky whiskies. Miyagikyo goes for softer, rounder, richer styles of whiskey. And due to the way the Japanese whiskey market works, they like lots of blended whiskey. However, they don't trade between the different distilleries. There's not many distilleries, but they don't swap casks or sell casks to each other. So each distillery who is making blends has to make all the whiskey they want to use in their blends themselves. Oh, sorry, missing somebody. There we go. And so because they have to create all this whiskey themselves, they create lots of different styles of whiskey within each distillery. So between Yuichi and Miyagikyo, they create all the different types of spirit they need in order to make all of their blended whiskies. They also bring in whiskies from outside of Japan to put into some of those blends. but they make a huge array of whiskies at those two distilleries. So Miyagikyo is focusing less on the smokier style that Yoichi does and focusing much more on a richer, grain-forward, malty, fruity, slightly obsessed, as I said, style of whiskey. And this on the nose, again, it very much, you can sort of see that style coming through. It's a bit richer than the previous one, but still has some of that sort of vanilla-y, fruity, rounded sort of character. Just keep an eye and make sure everybody's happy. So yeah, on the nose, and get even more of that sort of vanilla sponge cake and that sort of vanilla-y sort of side of things. But maybe with some sort of sultanas, maybe sort of a hint of that sort of raisiny, sort of jammy stuff underneath it. I go for my, what's it called? Reminds me of my school days when we used to get sort of porridgey semolina-y stuff with jam to stir through it, but they never used to give you enough jam. So it's like that's very, very sort of like a porridgey sort of thing. A hint of sort of jammy fruit behind it. Hi, Gareth. I've got that question you just sent over, the one on Facebook. So from Facebook, we have James Farrell has asked, how do you recommend refining your palate to pick up the notes and distinct flavors? I would call it practice. Other people would call it drinking. That's literally all it is. It's just practicing. I've been obsessively drinking. No, that's the wrong word. Drink responsibly, everybody. I've been drinking whiskey and thinking about it for about 20 years. I've been working in the whiskey industry for 9 years yesterday, which was quite nice. But for really what I've done is I just try everything I can, but not only within whiskey, but within other spirits as well. You know, behind the camera where you can't see, I've just got a pile of rum, shochu, and tequila. No, rum, shochu, and mezcal at the moment. So it's just looking out and trying different things, but also Mark Gillespie from WhiskeyCast, fantastic whiskey podcast. There's a secret hidden page on his website, The Confession of the Wife of a Whiskey Taster, written by his wife and his daughters, who talk about how embarrassing it is to go to the supermarket with their father/husband and watching him going around sniffing all the fruit and vegetables. It's all about getting out there and expanding your palate by trying more things. You can't taste something that's in a whiskey that you've not tasted in real life. So this is my excuse for being the size of a house, due to the fact that I eat everything that comes anywhere near me and I drink everything that comes near me, just so I can make sure that it's another thing added to my list of flavors in my head. And then when you're drinking spirits, it's all about practice of actually drinking, nosing, tasting, and sort of discerning flavors. It takes time, you know, it's years and years of drinking, smelling, thinking about it. You know, at the same time, you don't need to, you know, do silly tasting notes, go into massive depth and that. The most important thing is whether you enjoy something or not. You know, I've got a friend of mine who runs a whiskey club who writes flowery tasting notes like I do. And he has two other guys who run the club, one of whom sort of goes, well, it tastes a bit like apples, well, maybe. Another guy who has 3 different types of whiskey he likes, whiskey he doesn't like, and whiskey he really, really likes. And that's the only way he'll describe whiskey. So, you know, you don't have to go too in depth. If you want to, yeah, it's just practice. Or, as I say, as some people call it, drinking. So, is that all good, Gareth? Excellent. Thank you very much, sir. So, yeah, the Miyagikyo. I say this is bottled up. Is it 46? Yeah, 45%. So a little bit punchier than some, but still very much an example of the whiskey you can get from this distillery. And it's becoming more difficult to get over here because Japanese whiskey's blown up so much over the past few years that supply has been a real issue, because in order to put a whiskey down to mature, you have to look really sort of maybe 5, 10, 15 years into the future to see what things people are going to be wanting that far in the future. And that forecasting is very difficult. And so Nika especially been hit by a massive increase in popularity over the past few years. So their stocks are running low. So they've had to restrict stocks, have to remove it from certain markets and ration it out. So used to be able to get older Miyagikyo and Yoichi, not so much. They've discontinued a load of other stuff this year. But I hear there's more stuff coming down the line. They're doing more interesting things with different types of casks, creating new flavors. So there's loads of great whiskey still. And a few years down the line, the supply problems will be fixed. And then we'll have loads more great Japanese whiskey again. Anyway. Yes. There's a little sort of hint of ashiness at the back of that. tiny hint of ashiness, sort of like maybe a little bit of smoke. So it could be they're using some peat Miyagikyo as well. But again, the Japanese whiskey distilleries, they have such a range of spirits they produce. I was at Yamazaki, Suntory's main distillery earlier on this year, and their still room is the largest still room I've ever been in. Glenfiddich in Scotland's huge, but Suntory's one is, the Yamazaki one is massive, and every single still is different. And they pair the stills up. There's a load of wash stills and a load of spirit stills for double distillation, one then the other, and they pair them up in different ways to create different spirits. And they use slightly different washes, slightly different barley types and mashes and ways of doing things, and they pair that with the different pairs as well. And you end up with potentially hundreds of different types of spirit coming out of the distillery. And they can just create such a wide range of different things and different flavors. But putting them together, you can create pretty much anything you want, but this is very much going down that richer, maltier side, nice bit of fruit, a hint of ash at the back of it. Excellent. Big fan of Miyagikyo. I've not had it for a while. So, anyway, Gareth, any questions or anything at the moment? We're doing all right? Excellent. Cool. Let's move on to whiskey number 3. So, whiskey number 3 is a Mixer's small batch bourbon. So, moving over to the US, a slightly more traditional country when it comes to the wonderful world of whiskey making. Of all the countries we're looking at today, this is the one where most people will have tried a whiskey from there before. America has been making whiskey for hundreds of years. It came over with people who emigrated to the US from all over Europe. So not only was it the people from the British Isles, so the Irish, the Scottish, and the English who went over, but also folks from all over Europe as well. They have distilling traditions. And when they got to America, they found that the main thing they had there was a lot of grain and some apples. They made some really good applejack as well, but lots of grain. So people started making whiskey. And then as they started off actually over on the East Coast, making rye whiskey, because there's lots of rye grown over that part of the world. But as the migration west happened, they discovered there's lots of corn growing there. And as the corn was growing there, they started using corn to make their whiskey, and thus creating bourbon, which is at least 50% corn, and has now become the most popular style of American whiskey. Gareth, is that a question I see? Excellent. So, Gareth, what is your question?
We have Kevin Johnson on Facebook asking, "Hi, Billy. This is my first time tasting. Is it advised to clean your palate in between each one, and why, I guess?"
Cool. Yeah, I can answer that one. Thanks, Gareth. There are a number of different schools of thought on this, as there is with everything when it comes to tasting whiskey. The big thing is comes down to how you want to do it. I like to take a bit of a drink between things if they're going to be quite different, also because I'm thirsty. So I'd say always just have a drink of water as you're going along. Have some water with you, not only to clean your palate, but to just refresh your palate. Just make sure you're hydrated. This is high strength alcohol. It will strip the water out of your body if you drink too much of it. Stay hydrated, keep happy, all that sort of thing. But one of the things that people say about drinking water between drams or before a dram or drinking cold water is that cold water can cause your tongue to lose some sensitivity. If you cool down your mouth, then it's not going to pick up so many flavors. It's one way of looking at it. I can probably wax lyrical for several hours about the joys of flavor perception and things like that, which I won't do for now. But simply put, it's going to reduce the intensity of flavors if a liquid is cold in your mouth. And if your mouth is cold, it's going to cool the liquid. So some people say that drinking cold water between whiskeys is going to numb your tongue a bit. I mean, you can't taste things so much. I think that the effect is very minor. So I would say if you're thirsty, drink. And in between whiskeys, if you want to make sure that you don't want to interfere so much between them, then have a sip of water. But as you go through, you may notice I'm leaving a load of whiskey in each of these glasses, and I'd very much recommend going back and forth between them, because as your palate changes through a tasting, as you try things and the intensities of different flavors get imprinted on your brain, the whiskeys will taste different. If you go back to whiskey 1 now, just after whiskey 2, already smelling even fruitier to me now. Whiskey 2 still sells pretty much the same because we've only just had it. But after this bourbon, which is going to be a lot sweeter than the other two, you may go back and find the other two a little bit drier, and the style of the fruit changes. So I'd always say, drink lots of water when you're tasting anyway. Keep hydrated, makes everything a lot easier. But also jump back and forth. If you do want to take a sip of water or clean your palate in another way between drams, go for it. I used to, well, one of the things, if you start getting very confused, people say to sniff the back of your hand. It smells like you, which is like a default smell to you, because you know what you smell like, because you smell you all the time, if that makes sense. But other people talk about sniffing coffee beans. I have some in my desk drawer, which I used for many years to sniff before I tried whiskey. And I found in the end, it didn't really do anything. One of my former colleagues used to smoke a lot, and he would go and have a cigarette to reset his palate because that was his standard default flavor. He doesn't smoke anymore. He's a good boy. Don't smoke. It's bad for you. But yeah, so different people, different things. But I'd say work out yourself, have a drink. If you find that it interrupts your palate and disturbs your ability to taste, don't do it. But make sure you do keep hydrated, because yeah, you don't want to fall over while you're drinking whiskey. You're having a whiskey tasting, not a whiskey drinking. They are different things. So onto the mixers. So I say this is a bourbon. It is bottled out. What do they do this one at? 45.7%. And it's a very, very classically styled bourbon. It's a great bourbon, but also one that's very much classic, straight down the line bourbon. So bourbon uses a mash that is, so in America, they talk about mash bills. They have a recipe of which grains they use. So in Scotland, single malt whiskey is all made using malted barley. And the first two whiskeys we try today also are made with 100% malted barley. Whereas this bourbon has a recipe that has at least 50% corn, maize in it. I don't know the actual recipe. Mixers will not tell us the actual recipes. I have asked on a number of occasions. The people I've asked have smiled sweetly and then walked away. So all we know is it's a minimum of 50% corn. It's probably got a bit more in there. It's probably got a little bit of rye in there, and it'll have a little bit of malted barley as well. Not so much for the flavor, but because malted barley helps fermentation happen, which means you get actually some booze you can then concentrate by distilling. So bourbon is also matured in brand new casks rather than refill casks as you often get in Scotland. The English whiskey is a refill bourbon cask, so was filled with bourbon, and after bourbon was taken out, they filled it with English whiskey. The Miagikyo will be a variety of different casks, probably including some bourbon casks in there somewhere. So you get new cask, so a cask packed full of woody flavor, packed full of spice, packed full of vanillas, packed full of sweetness as well. Maybe not actual literal sugary sweetness, but flavors which get into the whiskey and compounds that get into the whiskey that remind your brain enough of those sugary things that they trigger the same sort of flavor reception in your mouth. Again, I can probably talk significantly too long about flavors, which I won't do at the moment. Oh, I've got a question online. Is there a good reason why all the bourbons seem to come from the South? Yes. As I said, when, sorry, that's from Alyssa on the Zoom chat. Hello, Alyssa. So when people arrived in the US first, they came in on the East Coast. And as I said, that's where they started out. There's lots of rye there. But when they emigrated westwards, a lot of people were offered free land or land on reduced rates. So I can't quite remember what they did was, in order to encourage that migration, people were offered farmsteads they could start growing. And as they moved over, the places where you could grow grain the best were generally further south. The place you can grow corn. And so as people started growing corn in these areas, they had leftovers and they started making whiskey. And so generally it started off down in the south as where they made all these styles of whiskey. Other parts of the country, they had a lot more ready access to imports. So up in the northeast, sort of New York and up towards sort of like wherever Boston is, Massachusetts, up there, up that corner, a lot of rum, because there's a whole load of sea trading going along. And so rum would come up from the Caribbean, and all along that coast, there's loads of rum. But in the south, there was less of that trade going on. So they're using local products, making whiskey. So these days, whiskey's made all over the place, and bourbon isn't made in Bourbon County and all these other things you hear. Bourbon can be made anywhere. Bourbon just states what the recipe has to be, as opposed to other whiskeys. There's lots of other rules as well, but bourbon is 50% corn, and it is made all over the place. But yeah, the birthplace is very much in the south where the grain came from. Anyway, on the nose, very, very sweet. That, yeah, as I say, it's not actually sugary sweetness, but it is actually quite reminiscent of it. Very, very caramelly and sort of that sort of toffee and sort of crunchy caramel almost. And a little bit of spice, but maybe there's a little bit of fruitiness in there as well. Yes, I'm obsessed with fruitiness, I know. But On the palate, again, you have that sweetness. For me, it's like almost like a butterscotchy richness and roundness there as well. But it jumps also into the sort of glacé cherry and sultanery raisin fruitiness. That sort of quite sweet fruit. Again, concentrated sweet fruitiness rather than the sort of more the apples and pears and tropical fruit I got in the other whiskies. So, people are still there. Good. Making sure. Yeah, so nice spice in there as well. Yeah, very much focused on, that sort of sweet, sort of toffee character. Mixers, tell a little bit about them. They are a distiller now. They have their own distillery, but these whiskies were made for them by other people to their specifications. They would go to the distillers and they'd run a few days every now and again to create the spirit they wanted to put it into their casks and then matured by them. But they didn't have their own distillery. They do now. They talk about how their name goes back many years, and it did. It actually went back to the East Coast. There's a distillery over there. I think it was called the Schenck's Distillery at one point in time, and it was the Bomberger Distillery at another time. And Michter's, the name comes from I think it's the children of Mr. Schenck, who are called Michael and Peter. So he created them a whiskey called Michter's to combine the two kids' names together. But the distillery shut down, the brand disappeared. But a company from New York, I think it was, stepped in a few years afterwards and bought the name and decided to start making whiskies in the same idea, same style as they used to back then. They've now moved all the operation into Kentucky, is it? I can't remember. Sorry, into one of the southern states where they do lots and lots of stuff. I think it's Kentucky. And they now have their own distillery, and they're still making the whiskey elsewhere as well as making their own. But their attention to detail and the way they look after the spirit, even though they've not actually made it entirely themselves, maybe, but they have looked after it, they have nurtured it, they have created these whiskies. It's massively over-specced, and the way they make it, fantastic. I'd say grab the folks from Michter's if you ever see them at tasting, or grab me. And I used to not be a fan of theirs, and I've been massively turned around over the years to really like what they do and like the whiskey they make. I've always loved the whiskey. I now really like the way they do it as well. So grab me sometime, I'll happily tell you all about it. Oh, another question. Hello, Tristan. Is it advisable to add a splash of water to whiskey to aerate it and get the best out of the flavors? Is there a specific amount you should add? This is another one of the great argumentative mysteries of the whiskey tasting world. As you see, I brought myself some water and a little pipette because I have no coordination. If I try and pour it out of a water jug, I'll just pour in half a pint of water. Generally, I say always add a little bit of water to your whiskey. Try it neat first, and then add a couple of drops of water and see how it changes. And remember, you can always add more water, but taking it out is sort of what distillation's about, and they've already done that. You don't want to do it again because it'll ruin your whiskey. And it's really difficult to get just a little bit of water out. So if you add the water in, add a bit more, add a bit more. At some point in time, you'll add too much and you'll drown the whiskey and the flavors will fall to pieces. But when you add it, it's not only, as you say, it's to aerate it. There's lots of things that happen when you add water to whiskey. You don't need very much. The reason why I use pipette is because I can literally just add some drops. So yeah, a little bit of whiskey, just add a couple of drops. And if you do that and have a look, I can't fortunately show you on the camera very easily. When you do that, you'll see lots of whirls in the whiskey, and people have made whole lyrical assertions about what this is. And it's mainly it's just water and alcohol mixing. Water and alcohol, when they mix, are a bit weird. So you can see all the swirliness as it goes around. But when you add that, one, it will break the surface tension. As it breaks the surface tension, it will help create some vapor in the glass. Two, it will dilute the whiskey and change the concentration of the various different flavor compounds in there. And that's not a linear thing. If you reduce one compound by a little bit in concentration and another one by a little bit, the amount that you can detect those won't drop at the same rate. Different compounds have different sensitivities. So a couple of drops of water will make certain things come out more than others just by changing their relative concentrations, relative powers in the whiskey. So you'll change it. And yes, the other one is you dilute it. You reduce the amount of alcohol. And whiskey is a high alcohol drink, and it really helps if you're not used to drinking high alcohol drinks to add a little bit of water, because that will help knock down the strength a little bit and stop that alcohol burn. Also, if you water it down a lot, you can release totally separate new flavors. I drink a lot of highballs where I drink whiskey with fizzy water or just whiskey and water. And if you drink it with 1 part whiskey to 2, 3, 4 parts water, you'll get a very different drink. We can still often taste the whiskey, depends on the whiskey, some work better than others, but yeah, really changes the flavors. But yeah, so to answer the question, rather than just ramble about water, I would say add a couple of drops, just like I did there, just like literally boom, 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 and then add a little bit more if you think it needs it. But I say always try neat, always try without water first, because you need to have that baseline to understand a bit more about how much you want to add. If you don't know what it tastes like, you don't know what to add. It's a bit like if you shove a load of salt and pepper on your dinner before you tasted it. If you don't know what it tastes like, in a way, you're salting blind, and you don't want to do that. That said, my uncle covers everything in pepper whenever he has a plate in front of him. So, each to their own. But, I would say, yeah, always try things neat. Add a little bit of water. If you think it needs more, add a bit more. Be especially careful with sherry cask whiskies, though, because sherry casks are very good at just dying if you put too much water in. So, anyway, what's it doing? Yes, talking about mixers. So, so this company bought the name, redeveloped it over the years, and they created this incredibly great high-spec thing. With lots of really interesting ones. They've got older whiskies as well. It's just, a load of stunning stuff. And a couple of years back, we run a Whiskey of the Year competition every year. Mixers do a whiskey called Sour Mash. They call it Sour Mash. Sour Mash is a part of the process of almost every single whiskey in America's production. So Jack Daniels talk about their Sour Mash whiskey. Yeah, that's called making whiskey. That's how you make whiskey in America. Sour Mash, it's a very boring scientific thing about lowering the pH of the mash by using stuff from the end of the still. And anyway, they call it Sour Mash because they can't call it anything else, because American law is very strict on labeling and what you can call whiskeys based on the recipes. And their recipe doesn't trigger any of the different categories. So it's less than 50% of any one grain. I reckon it's probably quite close to 50% corn and 50% rye, but it's just below, so they can't call it bourbon or rye whiskey. But it was really, really great whiskey. We put it into our Whiskey of the Year competition, and it was tasted blind at tasting by 50 of our customers who came along, and it won the competition. It's the first year that we had an American whiskey in the lineup, and when we revealed it was an American whiskey, it was a big shock to everybody. We knew what it was because we put the whiskeys and poured them, but the people in the room had just not thought it was an American whiskey at all. When it's more obvious, but it's such a great dram anyway. And so it picked up our Whiskey of the Year award. First time we've had something that was not Scottish win. So mixers, ever since then, I've been sort of thinking maybe I had to reevaluate when everybody else said they were great, and I've looked into them a lot more, and I very much agree now. So, but yes, the bourbon is an absolutely classic bourbon, but worth looking at the rest of their range. Anyway, should we move on to whiskey number 4? I think so. Any more questions? Anybody? Alice is looking happy. Good. Right. So moving on to our 4th one, Kavalan. And of all the Kavalans we could have chosen, we've chosen the Kavalan Sherry Oak, which is pretty much the style of whiskey that has made this distillery really big. So Kavalan is from Taiwan. And Taiwan is not necessarily the first place that people think of when you think of whiskey making, but that's because they haven't been doing it for very long. It's about a decade now, I think they've been going. Yes, I've seen the 10th anniversary bottling. So just over 10 years they've been going. And it was built by a company called King Car. King Car are a classic, huge aging company who do a bit of everything. And they bottle water, they do food, I think they do industrial equipment and medical stuff as well, as you do. But Mr. Lee, who runs it, came from a part of Taiwan up in the northeast corner called Yilan. And he really loved the area and wanted to get into whiskey, so decided to build a distillery in this sort of homeland of his family. They already had a water bottling plant there because King Car have, of course, everything. And they built this distillery next to it. And rather than starting small, the first private distillery to be built in Taiwan since they relaxed rules to allow people to do it. I think the WHO changed their, not WHO, well, WTO, World Trading Organization, changed their regulations to allow more trading in China and Taiwan. And so they built this distillery, and they built it absolutely massive. They opened it, and it's a fully fledged working major distillery. And they had another one next door to it, ready to go where they needed to as well. And they had to up production a couple of years ago because they were getting so popular. So huge distillery. Numbers of visitors, I think it's something stupid like they had 1 million visitors through the door in the first year. Taiwan, China, there's quite a lot of people there, and there's a lot of people coming through, and lots of people who go there for holidays. So you can sort of see there's a potential for it, but 1 million people is like more than all the distilleries in Scotland in one go. But the whiskey is the thing which most turn people's heads, because they start going for things like this. If you pour the whiskey, it's a massively dark thing, and on the nose, it's all about sherry casks and raisins and fruit and all of that darker side of whiskey. So they launched their Sherry Solist series, as they called it, single casks of really, really dark sherried whiskey. And you couldn't get it outside of Taiwan and Southeast Asia. And I spent ages trying to find some. And I got a tiny sample off a mate of mine and tried it, wrote about it. Absolutely stunning. And finally, it got over here. And they've increased the range. They've branched out from these original sort of big, punchy sherry and bourbon casks. And it's become very much more sort of open and varied in its style, from really nice fruity mango laden bourbon casks through to these ridiculously dark sherry casks and port casks and things like that. So the thing about Kavalan is that it's very hot over in Taiwan. Their warehouses, the temperature gradient, I think, between the bottom and the top can be 20 to 30 degrees centigrade. So you're looking at 20 degrees down the bottom, maybe up to 50 degrees at the top of the warehouse. So there's a lot of evaporation from the casks. And while some people talk about this climate making the whiskey age faster, you can't age faster. You just mature at the rate of 1 year per year, such is the nature of time. But some of the effects within aging will occur faster. And so interaction with the wood will happen more. Oxidation will happen maybe slightly faster. Evaporation definitely will happen faster. If it's hotter, more of it will evaporate, which will concentrate the liquid left in the cask. But it's very much the case that, it doesn't age faster. It changes in a different way, and certain aspects of it change faster. The overall sort of like oxidation, maturation, the thing you get from really old Scottish whiskies that sat in a damp, cold warehouse for years, you're not going to get that in a 7 or 8 year old Kavalan. But that huge hit of sherry cask intensity that you get in a whiskey that's been in a damp Scottish cellar for 10, 20 years, you will get that in a Kavalan whiskey very quickly. And that's what we have here. So this is matured in sherry casks. I think there may be some sherry finishes in here as well, rather than just full maturation. But it's a vatting which brings together a lot of their different styles of sherry to give you a well-rounded sherry cask whiskey. So on the nose, it really is. It has that leathery, dried cherry, raisin, dark fruitiness, which is a thing I'm a massive fan of. And it's the thing I was looking for originally when I first tried Kavalan. As I said, it was one of those ones where I spent ages trying to find one. And ended up a friend of mine who had met their former master distiller at a show sometime when he was visiting, because the distiller used to go to the University of Reading. I managed to get a bottle, maybe the only bottle in the UK, and he did me off a little sample of it. And I went around to the shop he worked in, and he gave me a little bottle under the counter, and as I bought a bottle for a friend of mine's wedding, and yeah, lots of cloak and dagger to get some of it. Now it's a lot easier to get hold of. But yeah, this dark sherry cask style is the thing which really made their name. So on the palate, it's bottled at 46%. The Solist series, the single casks, are all bottled around sort of 57.9, I think it is. So really big, punchy cask strength whiskies. At 46, this is a lot wider, a lot broader, not so intense, and doesn't quite bring a tear to the eye like some of the Solists do. This has still got that big, rich sherry, and it lingers into the finish. Sort of like, for me, it's all raisins and cherries. Really, really good. Those big, chunky, plump raisins, and really proper maraschino cherries, not these sort of the bright red, crisp things that mean soaked in formaldehyde, but proper maraschino cherries, like the ones I can see just out the corner of my eye. I'll come and see you later. But yes, that proper rich cherry sort of flavor to it. But also a little bit of leather, I say, that savory edge as well. Maybe a hint of sort of like damp floor in a warehouse. Marvelous stuff. But this is the sort of whiskey that really made Kavalan. They were only over in Asia for a long time. Then slowly but surely, we got a few bits and pieces over here. I went to their first show that they did over here. It was in Manchester, back in the previous days before I worked for the Whisky Exchange. And I managed to, went up to Manchester specifically just to go to a 1-hour masterclass with Cablan, and it was stunning, absolutely fantastic. Got to have a chat with Ian, the former distiller, the late Dr. Jim Swan, who was incredible consultant to distilleries who helped so many of these new distilleries work out how to work in their different environments to create really great whiskies. He was there and I got to have a chat with him. But most of all, I got to try the whiskies and see that it wasn't just a fluke the way they did these solists, the way they did their dark sherry. For me, their bourbon cask whiskies are some of the finest whiskies you'll find over in Asia. For me, in some places they surpass the old school Japanese stuff. But they're really great distillery and really great whiskies to have a try of, especially if you've not tried anything quite like it before. A little bit different to Scotland, very similar style of production, but just the environment it's matured in is so unlike Scotland, it creates something quite different. Oh, question, sorry. Sorry, a question, what do I mean on the palate? There's many different ways of spelling the word palate, from artist palate to wooden palates. Palate, I talk about basically the flavor. When I talk about the palate, I talk about what it tastes like. It's not only what it tastes like, it's all the things detected by your mouth. When you taste whiskey, and this is one of the things when I do my training, I try and teach people a load about how to nose and taste properly, how to understand the concepts of nosing and tasting, because the tongue is fairly rubbish at tasting things. The nose is very good at smelling things. And if you hold your nose and taste something, you can't taste very much because it's actually the nose which is picking up a lot of that complexity of flavor. So when you drink something, around the back of your soft palate in your mouth, there's a little sort of gap which goes around into the nose. So the nose and the mouth are connected. So when you drink something, your head fills up with all the different vapors and your nose smells the thing which you're tasting with your tongue, if that makes sense. The brain combines what your nose is smelling, what your tongue is tasting, what the whole of your mouth is tasting. So there's flavor receptors all over your mouth. And then it makes it seem like all of that flavor comes from the tongue because brains are weird. So when I talk about the palate, what I mean is what I get in the mouth, what I get from the bit where I actually put the whiskey in my mouth. You have nose, I have the palate, and I have the finish. So talk about what it smells like, what it tastes like, what it tastes like after I swallowed it. And the other key thing about palate, which I haven't talked about too much here, but often I bring in when I'm talking about sort of whiskies where it has much more of an obvious effect, is the texture. You can have quite a thin spirit, you can have a really thick and rich spirit. This Cablan is very much sort of sitting in the middle. It's got good texture to it, it's got some weight, it's got some thickness. But at the same time, other whiskies will have a lot more. Liqueurs will be really thick and sticky due to the whole sugariness that they have in them, inherent to the actual making of the spirit. But yeah, so it's everything. When I talk about the palate, I just mean everything that after I put the whiskey in my mouth, all the different sensations, flavors, textures, everything about it you get from sticking it in your gob. Hope that answers your question. Cool. Everybody seems to be happy. Right, shall we move on to the last whiskey? Excellent, let's move on to the last whiskey. So our last whiskey is from India, from Aerate. Aerate were the first Indian whiskey distillery to release single malt whiskey in the UK. I think they're the first legal whiskey to be launched over in the UK, because India's definition of whiskey is very different to the UK's and also Europe's. And due to the joys of international trade, they can't currently sell Indian whiskey, which meets the Indian regulations, but not the European regulations in Europe. And they've given loads of trade tariffs on whiskey being imported as well, because we won't let them export. And so there's lots of stuff going on the trade side of things. But what that means is that there's not a lot of Indian whiskey leaving India, because a lot of the Indian whiskey doesn't meet international regulation on what whiskey is. I've tried some of it and some of it's horrible. I've tried other bits of it and some of it's all right. But the single malts that come out, they are often the foundation of those whiskies. They're one of the things that gives them a lot of their complexity and flavor before they add other stuff in there, which isn't quite so good. But also increasingly, starting with Aerate, India was the first country really who sort of stepped up and said to Scotland, Ireland, and America, hello, we can make whiskey as well. They were laughed at. And eventually people came around to saying, actually, this can be really good. First things first, this is peated, so it's smoky. The peat does come from Scotland because Indian peat is not great to create the right flavors in whiskey. However, also it's 62.8%. So be careful. It is as cask strength as they come. This one, after you had a try of it, could definitely probably do with a little bit of water. But yes, Aerate, run by the I think the Jagdale family. One of the sort of the sons of the family was studying over in Newcastle, studying business, and tried to launch it as part of his business degree. He's talking about things. He brought this in, learned all these skills, and it didn't go particularly well. So they tried to relaunch it again a few years later, and they're up to Glasgow. And to launch an Indian whiskey in Glasgow sounds absolutely insane, and it is. But they had a chat with some of the bars who are friends of theirs, and they put it on as a mystery whiskey in a few places. And people would be trying this whiskey for a reasonable price and going, oh, yeah, it's pretty good. Oh, I like that. It's great. It's great. And at the end of the month, they reveal to everybody, by the way, you've been drinking Indian whiskey. And rather than the reaction you might expect of people smashing glasses and headbutting each other and other stereotypical things you might expect from Glasgow, they went, well, wow, that's really good. And all of a sudden, it got this big kick of popularity from this. It's like, wow, you survived launching in Glasgow, the heartland of Scotch whiskey, and people quite liked your whiskey. Well done. And it did well in other blind tastings, which people didn't realize. And the range grew, and people realized actually these guys at Aerate really knew what they were doing. My first whiskey competition I ever judged was won by Aerate Fusion. It was the first whiskey we tried of the day. We tried it blind, and it got such a high score. We said we should try this again at the end of the day because it's our first whiskey. We haven't, worked out the levels of all the scoring yet. It'd be weird to give the first whiskey of the day the top score. So we tried it again at the end, and it got a slightly higher score. So fantastic whiskey from Aerate. And this peated cask strength is showing a different side to what they normally do. Often their whiskies aren't peated, and this is. So, ooh. Sorry, I just got a question, but I'll get back to that in a second because I'll talk a little bit about Aerate first. So yes, they do some peated whiskey. They do lots of weird and wonderful experiments. Again, the laws are such that they don't have to be quite so strictly to the Scottish sort of method of very, very strict regulation what you can do. They can experiment a little bit more, and they do. So this is peated barley. The peat is from Scotland. The barley is probably from India. I'm fairly certain it's from India. So very old-fashioned styles of barley, which they then peat and smoke. They might import all of the barley. I might be wrong about that. I'm very sorry if I am. But very, very smoky whiskey. But again, matured in really hot climate. Very different to Taiwan. It's in Bangalore. So I think it's quite high up as well. So very, very sort of different sort of way that whiskey matures quickly. But you've got smoky barley here. You've got high strength whiskey because in India and other places where it's really warm and also where it's a lot drier than Scotland, water and alcohol both will evaporate out of a cask over time. But if it's drier outside, then more water will evaporate than if it's wet outside. And so if it's really dry outside, the alcohol in the cask can go up. And if it's damp outside, the alcohol in the cask will probably go down. The total content of liquid will both drop in both cases. It's just the proportions of alcohol and water that will change. In India, alcohol goes up. So this is 62.8%, but it could well have, this is probably, not dropped very much from when it was put in the cask. And really, really punchy, but still very concentrated in the cask as well. Lots of it was evaporated, concentrating the flavors that are still left behind. Ooh, so comment from Neil on the Zoom room of a hierarchy. So from today, he's reckoning England the best. I'm thinking this is best to least. Yes, so got the right order. England, USA, Japan, Taiwan, India. Almost in the order of the tasting. I don't know if I go quite the same order as that because I really quite like the Taiwanese whiskey. But yeah, it's one of those ones where the different expressions, people will find different things in them. But I know people who swear by this stuff, this Indian peated whiskey. It's an absolute monster. It's definitely one that can take a little bit of water. So quite savory. That smokiness is very controlled. It's quite warm. Definitely can do with a little bit of water. But one of the things people say about Amyrate's whiskies, they're often quite spicy, quite spice-led, and this sort of often comes from the whole stereotypical Indian food, lots of spices. But something like this, So most of the Amorets I find to be a little bit softer. This one's really spiky, lots of that savory spiciness to it, but it is really powerful, and that peat comes through as a bit of that savory spiciness as well. But yeah, even with a bit of water sort of brings out some brininess, almost like some ozone, sort of crashing waves and all that sort of thing. And there we go. Comment from Tori on the Zoom room saying Japan, US, India, England, Taiwan. Everybody's palate is different. Everybody will have different things they like. Everybody will have a different opinion. And that is one of the reasons why we like whiskey. I had a question actually, Alice posted from our Facebook page saying that I've been in whiskey for 9 years, but can I list my top 3 whiskeys 9 years ago and my top 3 whiskeys today? Has the list changed with more experience? Yes. Unfortunately, I never really had a top 3 list of whiskies back then. And I don't really have a top 3 list of whiskies today, because the things which I really liked are things which are just weird, ephemeral, random bottlings which just disappeared. You know, the distilleries I like has definitely changed over time. The styles of whiskey I like has definitely changed over time. Back 10 years ago, 9 years ago, where it was I started, I liked big sherry casks. I like massive, big, dark sherry. You know, talk about the Cavalan, things you could. I made a blend once with some Cavalan in it. I had a pipette. I was just dropping single drops into this blend, and you could see the drops fall through the rest of the whiskey, hit the bottom of the bottle, and go, because it's so thick and dark and evil. I like massive peaty whiskies as well, really thick, dark, damp, licoricey peaty whiskies. These days, I like what I refer to as boring bourbon casks. I like second refill and third refill bourbon cask whiskies. So not new, not second-hand, but third-hand and fourth-hand whiskey casks. Mature for, mid-teens, sort of like, 12 to 18 years around then, with some nice sort of like fruity Speyside spirit in it, maybe a lightly peated thing, something, if it's peated, maybe a little bit longer so some of the smoke dies away. I like more delicate things, like more intricate things now. But my palate changes all the time. We're currently we're May. At the moment, I quite like bourbon casks and fruity things. Give me a couple more months until we get around to November and December. I'll be straight back on the big sherry and the big peat. So it changes all the time for me. But the big thing for me, though, is that, yes, with more experience, I've discovered so many more styles of whiskey. And not only stuff in Scotland, which is the reason why I love this world whiskey sort of tasting, is because we get to see these whiskies from different places, which are reminiscent of Scotch. All of these different places, apart from mixers from the US, their whiskey production techniques have come from the Scottish model. They are pot still distilled, they are double distilled, and they're very much made in the same way. If you go and look around a distillery there, or look like a distillery in Scotland, but the tweaks they've made to the process, tweaks they've made to the ingredients, have created totally different styles of whiskey. And that's the thing I've learned over the last decade, is there are so much more out there. It's the classic, known unknowns, unknown knowns, and all, Donald Rumsfeld's famous matrix of wrong. But I didn't know then quite how much I didn't know. Now I do know quite how much I don't know. And that's the thing which I've learned so much, is this: I've learned what else there is to learn out there. The world of whiskey is very wide, with many things to talk about, many things to try. Ooh. Question from Facebook from Kilvington David. Any up-and-coming UK distillers you'd recommend? Just picked up some Dartmoor whiskey. I didn't realize the Dartmoor guys had actually made any whiskey yet. I remember seeing pictures of them schlepping an Armagnac still, I think it was, like an old Alembic, on a truck down to Dartmoor, into the church where they were doing stuff. But no, in the UK at the moment, the one which I'm slightly biased because they are my local, but the one I say keep an eye on is Bimba. Bimba means moonshine in Polish. The owner is from Poland originally, and he is a big lover of whiskey, and he's quite good at making it. His distilling team are great. He's a good blender, incredible palate. He's a very lovely guy, very quiet, big chap, very, very, very quiet. But they are quite literally a 25-minute walk down the road from me if I walk slowly and stop in at Asda for a burger. There's a McDonald's in our local Asda. But they are in an industrial estate in northwest London. It's ugly as hell, and they're making beautiful whiskey. I have their first edition in my collection. I've opened it for my whiskey club, one of the rare bottles that they got opened. I've tried some spirit from them over the years. I own a cask. I have a little cask of my own hidden away in the rafters there. But yeah, Bimba is a place I really keep an eye on. Just trying to think who else. There's so many popping up at the moment, all over England, especially. You know, the relaxing of some of the regulations, you know, probably coming on towards a decade ago now, has allowed distillers to be smaller. Because beforehand you had to be huge. Now you don't. And so it means you can get a license and you can make whiskey. Unfortunately, it takes a lot of money to make whiskey. So there's lots of gin distillers out there, some of whom are making whiskey on the side. But there's so many popping up. Some of them, to be honest, some of them aren't very good. Some of them have made some horrible spirit. I've been offered some things at shows by people saying, oh, what do you think? And I've gone, please burn this. Do not release it. Do not hurt the name of English whiskey with this thing. You know, but other ones, absolutely fantastic. I'm doing a tasting, in about an hour, actually, online tasting with the Lakes Distillery, whose early work I did not like very much at all, but whose more recent stuff I've absolutely loved. You know, got a new distiller, really knows what he's doing, but it's early days. There's loads of them out there, and I'm really interested to see how they develop, because we've seen so little from them so far that we don't really know how it's going to turn out in the end. It can take, 10, 15 years to really see how a distillery is going to go. It takes a lot of money to last 10 or 15 years, finding your way. So hopefully you'll see a load more soon from all these distilleries all over the UK, all over England especially. I'm really looking forward to seeing what they make. So, what we got here? John Fox says, have I had Macallan Ruby? Yes, a very long time ago when they launched it. If you look on the Whisky Exchange blog and search for the word Ruby, blog.thewhiskeyexchange.com, you'll probably find a rundown I did of all the different whiskies when they launched them, explaining how they're replacing the old Macallan range with tasting notes for all of them. If you like Macallan, and you like old school sherry cask Macallan, you'll like Macallan Ruby. Simple as that, really. Gareth, is there any more questions? Cool. Excellent. Oh, dear. Here we go. From an investment point of view, thank you very much, Tori. Would you recommend holding on to an already valuable bottle of Macallan? One of my rules that I have for working at the Whisky Exchange is I only give one very simple piece of investment advice. It is actually the investment advice that my boss gave me when I started. And if you know of Sukhinder Singh, the co-founder of the Whisky Exchange, he's a very successful whiskey investor. He's done very well with it. And if you ever get a chance to see his boardroom, it's one of the most spectacular whiskey collections you'll ever see. But the one bit of investment advice that he gave me, and the one which I give to other people, because I used to work in finance in a previous life, and I was really bad at talking about investment. I was a computer programmer. I didn't do it, so I didn't lose anybody money. But it's just one of those things I just don't get for some reason. I've invested in a very small number of bottles of whiskey. One of them I sold for £5 profit because a friend of mine gave me a fiver out of the goodness of his heart. One of them I sold for a profit after about a decade, where it was lost me money for most of that. And the other one I still have because it's currently worth half the price I bought it. So I'm not the person to listen to about investment. But Sukhinder has always said to me, if you want to invest in whiskey, find a whiskey that's really good, because really good whiskey is going to get drunk. And if people drink it, there'll be less of it. If there's less of it, supply and demand mean it'll probably be worth more. And if it's also really good, if it doesn't go up in value, you have a really nice bottle of whiskey to drink. Brilliant investment advice, and you can drink at the end of it. For Macallan, it's a minefield. We don't know how the market's going to go. Macallan has been very, very strong for so long. It could be that it softens over time. You never know. There are people out there who can give you investment advice based on financial investment and things like that. I'd potentially be wary of what they say. It's a very strange market in the whiskey world. Macallan, if you can hold on to it, as ever with these things, hold on to it. If you need to sell it, sell it. If you can drink it, I'd drink it. But remember, I understand entirely that, as I have bottles in my collection, sometimes it's not feasible to drink something that's worth so much money, especially when you can sell it and buy other things which are going to be just as nice. So, anyway, yeah, unfortunately, investment is a topic for another day. Sorry, if you ever meet me in person, ask me about investment. It's a thing you can talk about for way too long. And it's a very, very fractious field as well, from people who think whiskey should just be drunk, or people who think it can be investment. And so many arguments I've moderated on the internet over the years. We'll move away from that. Yes, yeah, and as Leslie says on our little Zoom room, Mortlach 4 and 4 and a fantastic whiskey. It went away Everybody drank it. It got really expensive. While it was around, nobody cared about it because you could always get it. Second it went away, everybody wanted a bottle. But at the same time, if you're talking about the Mortlach, look at the new ones. The new ones are good again. Anyway, right, I should probably get back to the ending of this tasting. I've been rambling about other things for a while. So, anyway, sorry, excuse me. Right, so. Aerate, yes. So, peated whiskey, last one of the night. This is a properly punchy jam as well. Definitely add a little bit of water to it if you can. It's not my top of all the Aerates. I really like the slightly richer styles they have, and this is very much that peaty, punchy sort of thing. It's beautifully savoury as well, and just shows off how different it can be. You know, this isn't a Scotch whiskey. You can tell it's not a Scotch whiskey. Yes, great dram. So that is all of our whiskies. If anybody else has any questions, if you pop them, if you're on Facebook, stick them in the feed. I'll be hanging around afterwards to jump on Facebook and have a look. I've got 55 minutes to my next tasting, so 55 minutes for me to answer questions. I'll be keeping an eye on those. If anybody's got any questions in the Zoom room, drop us a line here. I'll be hanging around a little bit after the main session if you have any questions there. But thank you very much for watching, everybody on Facebook, and thank you very much for coming along, everybody who's on the Zoom room. This is the first of our May tastings. We have 3 more coming up. They'll all be on Facebook afterwards as well, all tied in with great tasting packs on our website. We have the folks from Milk and Honey Distillery with us next week. We have Michael D'Souza from Paul John in India. And then we have James Bowker, who is the brand ambassador for Suntory at the end of the month. Loads of great whiskey from all over the world. Watch along, buy a pack, taste along, join in. But yeah, thank you very much for watching. Yeah, we will see you next time.